Hey guys, what is up? Super K-Man Rocks here, and I am here for my LEC round number 1 and kind of round number 2 overview and analysis video here in the start of the spring playoffs. We have the first side of the bracket here. We're still in the best of 3 stage. Everything we cover here today will still be a best of 3, but by the end of this, we actually played a lot of series. We're going to know our first 2 teams that have officially qualified for the top 4 that are going to be moving into winners finals, and of course also the first 2 teams that are eliminated from this side of the bracket. Typically speaking, we would not play all of these series in one weekend, but for some reason they wanted to double up on some of these, and so things have gone this way. We've got more series than expected in this round 1, but I'm excited for it. I hope you guys are as well. Let me know down in the comment section below if you are excited. Would love to know whether or not you thought the teams that did end up winning would actually win, or if you were surprised by the outcomes. Of course, if you want to know my thoughts on everything that's happened in the LEC up until this point, you can check out the playlist up in the iCard right now. That's week 1, week 2, week 3, all covered on this channel in terms of the regular season. So if you want my thoughts on how these teams have performed leading up to this, of course, that's the place for it. I do want to quickly rant at the beginning of this video because I don't really have any other place to put this rant, and I do kind of want to put this in here. What the hell is the LEC seeding for playoffs? It doesn't make any sense to me. I understand that it's like brackets, like 1 and 2 are the pool 1, right? And 3 and 4 are pool 2, etc., etc. And you have 1 from each pool on each side of the bracket, and then the top seed gets to pick the person that they want to face. It's way overcomplicated. It doesn't really make any sense, and it makes the regular season kind of pointless. We're gonna see it, but the seeding matchups in this tournament do not make sense, and the sides of this bracket are not balanced in any way, shape, or form, which I do think definitely hurts a couple of teams in particular. I think that this could have been easily solved just by doing, I don't know, a regular bracket, like 1 versus 8, 2 versus 7, etc., etc. Really don't know why LEC don't do that. It doesn't make any sense in my brain. I think it's a bad decision, but here we are with some very weird matchups and a very overcomplicated system that has no reason to be this overcomplicated. That, in my opinion, actively makes it worse, but that's my rant aside. Again, I had nowhere else to put that in the video. I didn't really know where to put that, so I'm putting it here, but let's not worry about that too much. Let's jump right into the actual analysis. Of course, if you are new here, what we do is go series by series, talking about the advantages and the disadvantages that each team was able to generate. I'll be giving a player of the series and a dud of the series for each individual series, and then we will be previewing the final series of the best of 3 stage as well as winners finals at the end of this episode, because we will know those 3 series for next weekend. I'm very excited. I hope you guys are as well, but without further ado, let's jump right into the video. We've got a lot to cover today, 8 full best of 3 series to cover in the video, and so let's start it off right with a pretty interesting matchup, I would say. The number 2 seeded Team Vitality taking on the number 8 seeded SK Gaming, and Vitality is going to pick up the win here. This is kind of the example that I was giving. Vitality is the 2 seed. They should be playing a team that is a little bit more difficult than SK Gaming. Theoretically, they wouldn't get the easiest team in the entire tournament in round number 1, but because of the way the pool system works, they end up on the same side of the bracket as the 8 seed, even though they didn't earn that number 1 seed in the regular season, and so they get the easy path to the next round as opposed to the number 1 seed, who gets, theoretically a more difficult opportunity. I don't think it's that big of a deal, but it's certainly kind of weird how the system ends up working out. Luckily for Vitality, they didn't bottle it. This was a super easy and a super great draw for them. Not that SK is a horrendous team. They definitely do have some good moments, but they make some major critical errors basically every single game, and they've certainly been on the downturn as of late, and Vitality was able to take advantage of that to move on to the next stage of the bracket. So credit to them. Player of the series for me is going to go to VTO in the mid lane. I think you could give this to either of the solo laners. To me, they were the most influential players in the series. Theoretically, I think you could give this to Carzzy in the bot lane because he was really good in games 2 and 3 on the Xayah and on the Kai'Sa, but golly, he ran it on the Yasuo in game number 1, and that just takes away player of the series for me. Again, I think you could make the argument that he was the best player in games 2 and 3, but if you're going to lose your team a game, not by yourself, but pretty actively in terms of how they played the Yasuo center lane, then it's just going to be hard for me to justify that. But the solo laners, I think, were good across basically everything they did. They were really good in games 2 and 3, specifically for VTO in game 3, obviously for Photon more in game 2. Both of the Jaces were really positive for Vitality overall, and I think that they were solid in game 1. They just didn't have enough firepower to actually be able to keep up with what SK was doing after that early game. So VTO is going to get it for me because I did find the Jace in game 3 to be a little bit more impactful. First of all, the stakes are a little bit higher. It's 1-1. Winner goes to the next round. Loser goes to lower bracket. You use that extra life. It's certainly not an ideal situation to lose, and so for VTO to step up in that moment is obviously big, but I think Photon was just a little bit less active on the TF. He was still very good. Trust me. Like, I want to make it clear that I still think he had a very good game, and he still had some very good macro. But I really liked how VTO played Orianna in game 2, and I'm comparing the Ori and Jace versus the Jace and TF. I just slightly go for VTO, but again, very similar performances, I would say, from the solo laners. Nice to see VTO stepping up. Not that he is a bad player by any means, obviously was an MVP, like top 5 guy in winter. He's just taken more of a back seat, I would say, here in spring. And a lot of people have said that's a positive, that this bot lane's getting more resources, playing more strong side, and they're kind of trying to limit the bad games. And Douglas, I think, has stepped up. Photon, I think, has really stepped up. And VTO is just been kind of a facilitator for those players and been more of somebody that's there to help them out. I think that is a good thing, but it's nice to see that they can still play through the middle of the map if they need to do it. It's such an important part of the game right now to be able to win through mid that, you know, VTO getting those resources in game 3 and being able to take over basically of his own volition, but also with a lot of help from Douglas is definitely a very good thing to see. And Photon's just great. Like, people will hype up Irrelevant, and part of the time it's very worth it. Like, you look at the Cassante game in game 1 and you're like, this guy is unbelievable. He's so good on SK. And then games 2 and 3, he's just outclassed by Photon, who is the better player. I don't even think a lot of people are going to try to argue that Irrelevant is better than Photon. I know people are high on Irrelevant, but I hope people aren't having that conversation because I think Photon is pretty clearly better. Love the Jace in game 2, and even the TF was still very good in game number 3. He did a lot of really big flashy plays that I think will catch people's attention, especially in the back half of game number 3, but I don't think his complete game was quite as good as VTO's. Again, it's really up to debate. I think both of them were excellent. I'm not trying to say that if you put Photon as player of the series that you're crazy or wrong in any sort of way. I think both of them were excellent. I just personally give the nod to VTO. Again, Carzzy and Hilly were a lot better down the stretch of this series after running it on Yasuo Senna. In game number 1, they started playing things that they were more comfortable playing. Hilly gets on his Zillion, which we know he plays at a super high level, and then, of course, the Rakan, another thing that he has been very successful on over the course of his career, and Carzzy gets to play some more traditional AD carries like Xayah and Kai'Sa and just kind of do that role at a high level. He's a very good team fighter as long as he's locked in and not just randomly over-positioning and putting himself in bad positions, and so this was a good series from them. Douglas was fine. I think Isma might have been a bit more consistent in terms of what he offered, but Douglas was definitely going for a lot more active plays, so I think you could argue that he had a bigger impact on this series, but overall, Vitality was certainly the better team as this series continued to go along. You can talk about how SK took that game number 1 and really made things interesting, but watching games 2 and 3, it felt like Vitality was definitely outclassing them in a lot of different moments, and so they were the better team. They're the right team to move on here. SK is just not good enough to be able to hang at this level. They're really on a cold streak right now, and, you know, they made some convincing arguments, I'll say, throughout this series that, oh, like, maybe they could win, and then they pick Camille support for DOS in game 3. I don't know if he's ever played this champion before, but if he has, it certainly didn't show up on stage. This was one of the worst support performances I've seen in a while. It's a no-brainer. DOS is going to get done of the series, even if it was just game number 3, which it kind of was. Like, he was pretty good the rest of the series. Maybe not perfect, but good enough the rest of the series, especially on the Rakan in game number 1. The Camille wipes away all of that. I mean, he solo lost game number 3. He was miserable in that performance, constantly going in and just instantly dying, not really understanding the mechanics of how the champion works. It just didn't feel like he was particularly practiced on Camille, and if that's going to be the case, pulling that out in a game 3 and a best of 3 in the playoffs, like, that is crazy. So, you know, very bold draft. They cooked a little bit, but they burnt whatever they were cooking in the kitchen. That is abundantly clear. I do think the rest of this team was fine. I think you could point to some mistakes that Nisqy made in the mid lane in terms of his positioning on Azir, where you typically think of that champion not often having to put himself in harm's way, but Nisqy definitely continuously trying to go for those big Shuriman shuffles, those big plays, the LEC Azir syndrome, as I like to call it on this channel, because that's just what LEC mids do instead of actually trying to deal damage from the backline. Not saying that's always a bad thing. Sometimes a great Shuriman shuffle can win you the game on the spot, but Nisqy, I think, was a little bit more trouble than he was maybe worth in this series on that champion. Isma, I thought, was fine. Irrelevant was very good in game number 1 on the Cassante. Exakick, I thought, was pretty decently solid throughout this series. Certainly didn't make any grievous errors. DOS was the one who was running it in game 3, and outside of that, I think SK was just a little bit outmatched in game 2, where they allowed players like Photon and VTO to actually generate, and Carzzy as well, to generate a lot of pressure and resources, and you're not going to win those 5v5s when you have those players on top. So for SK, they are going to move down to the lower bracket. You're not eliminated just yet. We'll see if they're able to stay alive later in the weekend, but for Vitality, this is a very, very nice win. Really happy to see it kind of come the way that it did, with a lot of the players on the team stepping up and not just a couple of lanes winning. I do think that they're maybe not as strong as their seed would indicate, and I think they had a really easy draw here to get into the next round with probably the weakest team in the entirety of the playoffs, but they still were able to win it, and that's really what counts in the end. Then moving on to the second series of the first day here, the second best of 3. And this one, you know, again, a theoretically harder challenge for the number 1 seed that really didn't turn out to be harder in any way. It's the number 1 seeded Fnatic taking on the number 6 seeded GIANTX. And of course, Fnatic is going to be able to get over GX. They are the better team. They are the better of these two teams by a pretty clear margin. And while you can look at this and say, oh, it's not fair that the 1 seed had to play the 6 seed, which I am doing, by the way, I think that's only because the 6 seed ended up being GX that this turned out to be okay. Like, GX is not a team that is usually going to get around this seed, but they go 3-0 in the final week of the season. They get themselves up to 4-5 in terms of series, or game record, I should say, so they get this opportunity. But Fnatic made the right choice on their side of the bracket, picking GX over Mad Lions, because GX is absolutely worse than Mad Lions, or at least you would project them to be. But really nice series from Fnatic, and I think it's, again, in the ways that are both encouraging and not encouraging at the same time. There have been more concerns to me across the back half of spring than there really were in winter, even though I think they're a better team in spring than they were in winter. I don't know how that makes any sense, but I hope that's kind of getting across, is I do think that there were more things I can point to and be like, well, if this doesn't work, then I think they lose, but it's working right now, so that's really nice to see. Player of the series, honestly, player of the series goes to the bot lane, like Noah and June, the collection of the two of them for Fnatic, because they were able to push Fnatic over the top, I would say, in both games. I think it was Noah more in game 1 on the Lucian, really being able to create a lot of those almost assassin-oriented catches in the mid game to be able to push them really quickly forward. Patrick had a really rough game number 1 in this series, and then in game 2, it was the Tom Kench. It was June just everywhere on the map doing a lot of the dirty work, if you will, a lot of the heavy lifting in terms of how they end up performing. They've been the weakness of this team, or at least one of the weaknesses of this team over the course of like the beginning of this year. And so to see them kind of come into their own as things continue to go along. Noah obviously requested to play with June in the offseason. We knew that was the reason that Fnatic was bringing him in as the starting support, and I think it's finally starting to pay some dividends. I think June has played probably his 2 or 3 best games as a pro, like regardless of whether he's in the LEC or the LCK in the last like week or so, the end of week number 3 and then here at the start of the playoffs. I think that is an encouraging sign. Hopefully that June can continue to grow and start that development process that he just never underwent in the LCK. But Noah is officially going to get my player of the series because I do think he was the one that was probably a little bit more flashy in terms of his execution. Again, not trying to take anything away from June. His Tom Kench game in particular was amazing in game 2, but I think the Lucian and the Jinx were both very positive from Noah overall. And then when you look at the rest of the team, there are also positives there. Oscar Rinnan had a really good series, and you know, one of those games was on Cassante. That's definitely something that we've become accustomed to, but Rek'Sai honestly kind of fills a very similar niche for Oscar Rinnan in the top lane, gives him a lot of prio and power in the early laning phase, and never really becomes entirely useless just because the champion kit has so many utilities. And so I like the idea that if the enemy team is going to ban out Cassante like they frequently do against Fnatic, because it's really Oscar's best champion by a large margin, that you can still go to this like pseudo bruiser in the Rek'Sai that can be tanky, that can do damage, that can kind of just be a jack of all trades pick and still be very successful. We'll talk about his lane opposition on the other side of this matchup as we continue onwards, but at least Oscar Rinnan did what he was supposed to do, and he was definitely the better top laner. He gapped Odoamne on the other side of this matchup. I think when you're talking about Razork and Humanoid, I certainly don't want to come across like I'm saying they played poorly in this series, because I don't think they did. I think Humanoid had a couple of errors, I would say some LEC Azir moments in the back half of some of these games, but for the most part, it actually was setting up his AD carry to do a lot in these fights, and Oscar Rinnan was also very useful, and Razork had some great engages, even if he wasn't necessarily like eye-catching in this series in the same way that he has been in recent weeks. My only concern is that, you know, Razork and Humanoid have not been on the same like game-breaking path that they were on in winter. I was really getting excited about these two because they had never really played all that consistently together over the course of any regular season, and in winter it happened. Humanoid was the runner-up to my MVP. Razork was definitely in the conversation for my All-Pro in terms of the winter split, and, you know, similar conversations could have been had about the spring split here. Razork was very much in the conversation for me about an All-Pro. Unfortunately, I gave MVP to another jungler, and so he didn't end up making it, but he absolutely would have gotten it in most years, if not for Yankos, who I think was super important. The concern has been that Humanoid has been a little bit less consistent in terms of limiting those negative plays. That's always been a bit of the problem when it comes to Humanoid, is that he is very aggressive, and he is just, you're gonna have to live with some of those negative plays every once in a while, but for the most part, he makes up for that in that he is really talented, and so when he's able to get in these team fight situations, he often does really well. Still getting caught out a little bit more than maybe you would like to see, but I think generally, like I said at the beginning of this, Fnatic is the best version of them that they have been all year long, and a lot of that is this bot lane coming online. I think Oscar Renin definitely has potential to be a relatively good player. He's just not been able to do it consistently at all for them. But if Razork and Humanoid can continue to be like that dominating presence and the bot lane is working, this will absolutely be a top 2 team in the league. And then for GX on the other side, they're fine. Again, this continues to be the team that I will say the same thing about over the course of this year. High floor, low ceiling. There are a couple things they do really well, but if they go up against a team like Fnatic that is just able to outpace them and outplay them, they're not going to be able to keep up in those circumstances, and that's what happened here, although there were some low floor moments, mostly coming from Odoamne in the top lane, who's going to get dead of the game, or dead of the series here on 2 games of Twisted Fate. Another series where it just didn't feel like the player was particularly comfortable on the champion that he was piloting. I'm sure Odoamne has practiced and played TF before, but man, it did not look like it. Some of these plays on TF were just not good. He made TF look like a really weak lane pick, in particular into Rek'Sai, and that's really just not how this is supposed to go. And so you do have to look at Odoamne and say you have to be better. He has, for the most part, been a negative for GX over the course of this year, and he's definitely having the worst year of his career up until this point, in my opinion. That is not what you want to see from Odo. It felt like he was getting back on the right track. He was very good in the final week of the season when this team went undefeated, but that did not carry over into this series at all. I think you could say similar things about the facilitators for GX. Both Peach and Ignar, I think, really struggled. Patrick really struggled in game 1, even if he was a lot more relevant in game 2. And Jackie's had a lot of really good moments. The problem is his laning is really bad at the moment, and a part of that is going into Humanoid, who is a very, very good mechanical player. And so when you're isolated in these 1v1s, even when you are playing things like Akali and Yone into Azir, you're never really going to have a ton of kill pressure, because Humanoid's often in the better position, and he's often setting up the rest of his team to capitalize on your mistakes in a better way. But man, Jackie's team fighting was really good in this series on the Assassins, and he's shown flashes of some really good stuff throughout his short time, I would say, here in the LEC. He's definitely the most intriguing player on GX, even if he certainly isn't the best at the current moment. I think GX is certainly a fun team, an interesting one that I can't really find a way to hate in their current iteration, but they're not going to be able to beat a team like Fnatic, especially when the bot lane steps up like this. Noah and June were excellent. Oscar definitely outplayed his opposition, and I think when both of those things happen, they're just not going to lose, because there's a certain floor that you get with Razork and Humanoid in the late game if the rest of your team is able to get you there. My only concern would be that Razork and Humanoid haven't been perfect every game, and oftentimes in situations like that for Fnatic in the past, this team has struggled to win when they're not dominating. But if Noah and June and Oscar Renin are going to be fine, this team is going to be a danger to be maybe even champions if things go entirely right for them. Then moving on to the third of the first round series here in the playoffs, and this was the one I was the most excited for. 2 of the top 5 teams, and I really do think it's kind of a top 5 in the LEC at the moment, so seeing these 2 teams go head-to-head is great. It's the number 4 seeded Team Heretics and the number 5 seeded Team BDS. And BDS is going to pick up a 2-0 series win. This was not a particularly close series. BDS definitely outplayed Heretics, specifically if you're looking at the final game of this series. Game number 2 was very much in their favor, but I would say even game number 1, it never really felt like Heretics was going to win it. They were just staying alive in that game, and that was kind of their goal. But then you look at game 2, they draft something very similar, Heretics that is, and they allow BDS to get things that are similar, and BDS just executes on it better. Clearly, they knew what they wanted to do in that game a little bit more obviously, I think, in their performance. So really happy to see that for Heretics. They go down to the lower bracket once again. Same story as last split. You know, the changes really made it feel like this was a more cohesive team, and honestly, their macro has been maybe the best in the league leading up to this, which is why I think I'm so concerned that their macro was so horrible in this series that it was really, really bad, losing objectives for nothing, actively not doing anything. This honestly felt like a rogue game from Heretics, which is one of the worst things you could possibly say in the LEC in 2024. So we'll go ahead and talk about it. For BDS, player of the series is going to go to Ice. I know a lot of people are looking at the Zeri and saying like, oh, well, he had a pretty easy job to do in this series. And while I would agree the job was relatively easy, he was still the one who went and executed on it. It's funny, ever since Smolder came out, people have completely stopped complaining about Zeri as a champion and how broken and ridiculous she is. I do think she takes quite a bit of skill to execute at a high level, because she really doesn't have like all of these ridiculous tools to burst you down instantly if she's not ridiculously ahead. You know, she's a scaler and her range really isn't that long outside of the W. Obviously, she's got mobility, but I think there is a lot of positioning for lack of a better word, mechanics that do go into a champion like Zeri that make it very obvious when you see a good player play her versus when you see a bad player play Zeri. And I do think that came into effect here. Ice has been very good across this year, and while BDS certainly has not lived up to what they were in winter so far in spring, this is a good sign that that version of that team is still in there, right? That you can still get a lot of these more positive performances. I think obviously Ice is definitely a player I'm looking at as, wow, you played really great, but Sheo I think is definitely somebody that you're going to have to look at in a very positive light after this series. He was my player of the week for the third and final regular season week in the LEC. I thought he was really starting to peak at the right time, which is very interesting because when this team was doing well in winter, when they were winning a lot of games and when they were producing at a high level, Sheo was kind of the weak link of the team. He was the one that hadn't quite caught back up to his 2023 form at the beginning of the year. So now that the team is struggling a bit more, just getting above 500 in the final week of the season, now Sheo is starting to play the best league that he has played all year long, in my opinion. Better late than never for sure, but it would be really nice if the entire team was able to do that more consistently. Luckily, that's kind of what we got in this series. LeBron was very good. I'm glad they put him on two playmakers. Give him a hook champion. Give him something he can go out there and actively, play mechanically, and he's going to execute at a high level. His mechanics are just elite. I think there is an argument to be made that, him and Mickey X are 1A, 1B in terms of supports, especially with Mickey kind of struggling a bit more than he normally does across this year so far. And then Adam and Nuke were fine. Nuke was certainly good on the Karma, didn't really have to do a whole ton, but this was a Zeri takeover performance. This was Sheo winning the jungle matchup by a lot, certainly being more aggressive, certainly having a better macro plan, and BDS in general as a group of five, knowing what to do on the map a little bit cleaner than what Heretics was able to do, which was just not very good. Dud of the series is going to go to GIANTX in the jungle, and I really don't see how you can give it to anybody else in this series. He was my MVP of the regular season. I thought he was the most valuable player to his individual team of anybody. I think you could, again, make the argument that it was Caps for a second split in a row, but I thought GIANTX was excellent for a Heretics team that definitely got better, and a lot of that was the fact that this team had very good macro in the regular season. That's how they were winning a lot of their games, was just being able to get these small advantages over and over and over again until all of a sudden now you're up 5, 6k gold and the game is over. You can't really win any fights. GIANTX was really good at that, but he was really bad at that in this series. He was going for small plays, but in the most derogatory way I can possibly get that across, where he was going for non-factor plays. He was going for ganks into lanes that really wouldn't get him any sort of prio in those lanes if he were to get them. He was not contesting objectives nearly as aggressively as he was in the regular season. Actively playing really slow on a champion like Volibear into a Viego. It's really just not an ideal series from him. I don't know if it's Volibear as a pick. We've seen it work really well in North America in particular. That's really been the region that has taken Volibear and used him at a high level, but this champion looked useless in this series, and if that's going to be what he is in the LEC, then don't pick him. I mean, he certainly is not the kind of champion that you have to go to in terms of his numbers. I do think there were other problems here. I certainly don't think Zviru helped things out, playing Orianna 2 games in a row and just being super passive. These are the kinds of champions that he was really good on in the ERLs, but if you're going to be super slow, and if your jungler is going to be super slow, and if you're giving over the prio, the pressure in the middle of the map, all of a sudden this game becomes a lot more difficult. The meta right now, I've talked about it in a ton of different videos across this channel, but the meta right now is generating prio through the middle of the map and then dispersing that to wherever you find it to be the most valuable. But if you don't have that prio in the middle of the map, honestly, it's a lot harder to win games right now. So Zviru being so slow, being so controlled, I think was a negative. Trimby, I think, wasn't very good in this series. Those Alistair engages, just not ideal. It really doesn't sync up with the rest of what this roster or this draft wants to do as well, I should say. Wunder and Flackhead were generally fine. They certainly weren't the biggest problems in this series. I think GIANTX, Zviru, and Trimby really did not play well, though, and they're going to have to be better. Again, one of the big reasons why I think this team does feel like they are better than what they were in the winter split is because GIANTX now has a mid laner that will take more of a backseat, where he can be more of the facilitator, where he can control the tempo a bit more, the way that they want to play the game, and Trimby obviously coming in being a primary shot caller is helping that in that same vein. However, none of that translated to a pivotal best of 3. They go down into the lower bracket now. Obviously, you never really want to be one series away from getting eliminated, but this team can still make a run if they can figure out what their issues are. But for BDS, really nice win. If they are getting back to the form that they were at in winter, except with an upgraded Sheo, that's very dangerous. That's a top 2 team in the league, and at least in this series, they looked like a borderline top 2 team in the league. I was hesitant on making changes to my power rankings going in to the first weekend of playoffs because you just didn't really know how these teams were going to be able to perform, but it's clear that BDS is a lot better than the number 5 team in the league, and they are likely going to be competing with G2 and Fnatic for those upper spots. Then moving on to our final of the round 1, or at least the upper bracket round 1 matchups. It's a rematch of the finals from the previous split here in round 1. The number 3 seeded G2 Esports taking on the number 7 seeded Mad Lions Koi. And G2 is going to repeat that finals performance with a 2-0 win here in round number 1. Not entirely surprising. MDK has not looked anything like what they looked like last split. I think their consistency has gone down. I think their explosive plays have honestly kind of gone down as well. I just don't think this is nearly as strong of a team as they were last split, but G2's still kind of clicking. You didn't got to worry too much about them. You weren't worried that they were going to show up, or they weren't going to show up in a best of 5 or a best of 3 or anything like that. This team always gets better as the games get more important, and that's exactly what they did here. They were very consistent, even though some of the problems that I have been highlighting a lot over my weekly reviews very much stayed alive in this series. They were still good enough to be able to pull it off, mostly because they have the clear-cut best player in the region. It's not even remotely close right now. Player of the series is going to go to Caps, and he is just better than everybody else that he is playing against. It is honestly not fair to watch Caps play against like Frescowie, who's a good player and honestly was fine generally in this series, but Caps is so explosive in the plays that he's able to make, and it doesn't really matter what champion he's playing. 20-25 minutes into the game, he's going to make this gigantic team fight breakthrough that's just going to push G2 over the top, and you're not really going to be able to do anything about it unless you have a player of a similar quality on the other side, which nobody has because nobody's on the same tier as Caps right now in the LEC. Then you're just going to lose these games. He truly is the S+ of the LEC right now, and it's really fun to watch. It's fun to watch him get back into that 2019-2020 form that he was in, 5 years ago. It's really nice to see that version of Caps kind of reassert himself, come back into the LEC after what was good years, but maybe not like exceptionally phenomenal, best in the league by a large margin years in 2023 and 2022. So, Caps played 2 games of Taliyah, was everywhere on the map, was dealing the most damage in the game, was winning team fights on his own. You're not supposed to do that on that champion. I don't think you need me to tell you that, but really, you're not supposed to be able to do that on that champion. He was able to do it nonetheless. I think Hansama was pretty good here. His positioning was sometimes, again, a little bit maybe over-aggressive, but for the most part, he was solid. Yike was definitely the better jungler out of the two, even if his scoreline doesn't necessarily represent that. I think he was definitely better than his scoreline would indicate. Very active on the map, consistently looking to try to make plays alongside his mid laner. Again, goes back to what we've been talking about. If you really control the middle of the map with your jungler and your mid laner, the two most important roles in the game right now, then the game becomes significantly easier to win, and that's exactly what G2 was able to do. Broken Blade was definitely the better of the two top laners. Just happy to see him pull out Rek'Sai and Twisted Fate, just like he was in the regular season, and continue to look good. If there was a concern with G2, it is very clearly Mickey X, who continues to have some very questionable plays. I've been talking about it all year long, even in the winter. Mickey has not been that guy so far. He really has not been that #1 support in the league. Coming off of an MVP season where he was the best player in Europe last year, it is really disconcerting to see him go back to like 2022 Excel form. That was my concern going into last year, is that he really wasn't good at the end of 2022 when he did come back on Excel. He was a big negative for that team and a very inconsistent piece. He was the reason that they lost to Fnatic in the playoffs and that they inevitably, got eliminated and didn't make Worlds. I think Excel had a real opportunity that year, and I think a lot of that form and a lot of the reasons he was struggling in that year have translated so far to 2024. I do want to say, though, obviously the team around him is significantly better now than it was in 2022, so he can get away with a few of the things that he wasn't getting away with before, but he's still making a lot of negative plays. I would argue more negative than positive plays right now for Mickey X. He was a negative for them, specifically in the regular season. We expected that to kind of reel itself in the best of 3s. I think I said like, oh, Mickey's performing really poorly right now, and that's a bit concerning, but we're all expecting him to just bounce back and be perfect in the playoffs, right? Well, now we're in the playoffs and he's still kind of underperforming. I still expect him to be better, especially when these series get more relevant and when he really does have to step up, when him and Hans really have to become this best bot lane in the region kind of thing, but it just wasn't there in this series, and I think that's worth noting. But outside of that, G2 was very good. The top 4 members of this team definitely did more than enough to be able to push them over the edge. And then for MDK, a couple of players that I think you can highlight as not having phenomenal series here. Mirwan's going to get dud of the series. I think that was a pretty easy call. When you're going to pick something like Varus top, you're going to go for those crazy Mirwan picks that we've gotten very used to here in the LEC. If you're going to do that, you have to be relevant, or else you're going to get completely clowned on, and that's exactly what happened here. Twisted Fate just made that Varus pick look completely inept. He was really not relevant at any point in that game and was consistently getting dove. The lack of mobility, the lack of survivability on that champion really cost them in a lot of mid-game skirmishes and gave G2 so much pressure in that game number 2. Same thing, similar going to Elyoya in game 2 here on the Ivern. Also on the Rengar in game number 1, it just didn't really feel like he was ever in control. I hate Rengar. Unless you are a Rengar one-trick, do not be playing him in pro. I just do not think he is strong, especially when you're pairing him up with another pseudo-assassin in Ahri in the mid lane. You have no consistency, and if you lose that tempo, the game is over, and that's what we saw in the first game of this series. But the Ivern also wasn't relevant. You're relying too much on your teammates, in my opinion, with these drafts for Elyoya, a player who has been a playmaker, somebody who has created a lot of opportunities. You just don't have the same kind of chances here on Rengar and Ivern. So I really don't like those draft decisions. I think Supa also made a grave error towards the back half of game 2. You know, dying at Gromp, getting caught out there. That is kind of a game-losing play, but I think outside of that, he was okay this series. Again, maybe not perfect. I know people love to clown on him because anytime any player comes out and, you know, proclaims that they are the best in their role in the region, all of a sudden the microscope gets very, very close to that player. Every single thing that they do is now being judged at a much more aggressive level than maybe they were being judged for before. I've said on this channel before that I think Supa has the best mechanics of any AD carry in the region. I think when you watch him, ADC is a very weak role in the LEC, in Europe, just in general right now, and I think that Supa is one of the few players that actually can just make these ridiculous plays and can do so without actually sacrificing his stability. You know, someone like Carzzy, I think, has very good mechanics, but you're going to get horrible games out of Carzzy. You're going to get the 0-7, 0-8, 0-9 performances out of Carzzy. You just don't get as many of those out of Supa, which is why I've preferred him as an AD carry, but, you know, I don't think it's some sort of gigantic gap between him and some other AD carries like Hansama on the other side here, and he is still young, and he is still going to make mistakes like he did here. I don't think it was as big of a deal as people like to say it was in this series, but obviously, it ended up mattering. I think Alvaro was fine, and Frescowy was actually perfectly fine in comparison to, like, what he should have been going into Caps, who was just dominating this game, but he never really had prio, never really had pressure. A lot of that was the jungle matchup losing, but, you know, MDK just looked outclassed here. This is a team that I really don't know how to feel about right now, because they're not playing well. They really haven't played well all of spring, but this was a team that made finals last split. I do think that they are going to struggle a lot more. I think this is a team that I'm not going to say we're definitely going to expect to miss top 4, but I wouldn't be surprised that now moving into the lower bracket, if this team ended up missing top 4, it really wouldn't shock me. But for G2, this team has the expectations of winning everything across this entire year. They already won winter. They really have no reason to win spring other than skipping the play-in stage of MSI, which might even be a benefit to them. So I don't really know what they're going to do. I don't know how locked in they are, but at the very least, it's nice to see G2 coming out and winning series that they should be winning. But now that we've wrapped up our round number 1 series, it's time to move into our round 2 series, or at least the upper bracket here for round 2. The winners of these next 2 series will qualify immediately for the top 4, the best of 5 stage, if you will. So very important to win these 2 series. We're going to start on the lower side of the bracket, maybe surprisingly. It's the number 2 seeded Team Vitality taking on the number 5 seeded Team BDS. And BDS is going to pick up the win here. They're going to move themselves into winners finals, into the top 4. This is obviously a great place, a great position for them to be in. It's exactly where they were last split. But now, theoretically speaking, you're going to have your full 5 starting lineup throughout the entirety of the playoffs, or at least that is the hope when it comes to BDS. They played really well in this series. Of course, a couple of, you know, things here or there that I think they could have cleaned up, that I think they could have done a bit more efficiently. But I think overall, this was a pretty good showing. And the fact that they are still winning series, I think, is a positive. For Vitality, this team is fine. I think they are a good team, but I think right now I'm of the opinion that they are the weakest of like the big 5 in the LEC. I really think there is a clear top 5. Maybe Mad Lions could theoretically sneak into that. I think if everything ends up going right for them as the number 16, but right now there is like a clear top 5 to me in the LEC. And while Vitality is very much a part of that big 5, I think they are clearly better than like the mediocre teams in the league. I think series like this help to remind me that their consistency is just a bit of a problem, and they really shouldn't be favorites to get into that top 4. Now, the bracket has played out in a very positive way for them so far, and I do think that there is a potential for them to just get into the top 4 because of that, but I don't know if this is a top 4 team in the league, and I think this series ended up showing some of those flaws. But for BDS, let's go ahead and talk about it. Player of the series for me is going to go to Nuke, mostly for that Hwei game in game number 3. You know, Nuke's gained a bit of a reputation for being kind of an underperformer in big moments, and part of that, I think, is genuine. Like, part of that I think is deserved. I think he was awful in winter playoffs after having a really good regular season, and he's also been kind of bad in big moments for other teams in the past, not only BDS, but for Schalke. Back in the day, it wasn't necessarily a strength of his as a player, but this was a series where he needed to step up, and he did. So it's really nice to see that, you know, even in some high-pressure situations, this is a high-pressure situation, even if it's not the highest pressure situation in the world, he can still go out there and perform at a pretty good level, and I think this was a really solid series. Again, again, maybe cleans up game number 1. The Syndra didn't really look all that ideal, even if I do think that champion is a little bit weaker. I still think she's very playable, but a little bit weaker than maybe what he played the rest of the series. But the Hui in particular is why he's getting this player of the series. He dominated the third and final game, and that's really the game where you need to step up the most. That's the one where you want to see a lot of that positive progress. Ice as well. I mean, he's so good at Zeri. At some point, you're going to have to start banning out this champion consistently against BDS because he's just going to dominate team fights. He's going to rack up pentakills, and he's just going to make things a lot easier for them, and that's kind of what we're seeing here. I know people like to say that it's the champion that's, you know, overbalanced, and, you know, we've talked about it on this channel before. I think we've already talked about it in this video. Zeri is pretty skill intensive, at least at this level in terms of the positioning, so Ice showing up and just kind of being able to outplay everybody that he's playing against after he gets ahead, it's a pretty good thing. Of course, champion does help at least a little bit. I thought LeBron was excellent in this series, though. I love him on these engagers. I love him on playmakers. He is a playmaker. That is the way to describe LeBron's playstyle. It's why he was so successful and is still successful on things like Blitzcrank as primary carries, right? Is because he's going to be moving around the map, and you put resources into him. If you try to take action around him, he's going to, you know, really give you a lot of good opportunities to get gold onto your carries. And so credit to Ice, credit to LeBron, credit to Nuke. They were great. Adam and Sheo were fine. I don't think they were problems. I think Photon's a very good player, so I'm not shocked to see Adam struggle at least a little bit in this series. And Sheo, I think, definitely wasn't perfect. Like, this wasn't the same kind of series that he had in round number 1, where he was just able to kind of outplay his opponents, but it was still good, and I think that's all you're really looking for. Overall, BDS making their way into winners finals once again for the second split in a row. It didn't really matter that the regular season was a little bit more disappointing. There is a high chance that this is at minimum a top 3 team, and they've confirmed themselves for top 3. I know I said top 4, but as I'm recording this, I'm realizing that if you're in winners finals, the worst you can do is get top 3. And so congratulations to BDS in terms of who ends up making it. This is actually really good for them because, you know, championship points are actually very valuable right now. If G2 ends up winning the split, it's championship points that decide who goes as the second seed to MSI. So BDS being a team that, you know, got top 3 last split is is going to get top 3 again this split. It's good consistency, but hopefully we can see this team make finals. And then for Vitality, you know, I'm not shocked to see this loss. They're overperforming, I would say, relatively speaking. There are a lot of very good teams in the LEC, but this is kind of the outcome you would have expected from a Vitality team. They were doing really well in the regular season, but how much could they keep that up? Well, it turns out they're okay. They're good. Like, they performed in this series. They certainly kept up for parts of it. They just couldn't quite get over the hump in games 2 and 3, which were dictated by BDS. Done of the series was actually kind of difficult. I really don't think anybody individually made, like, horrible errors. I'm going to give it to Hylissang because I do think he was over-aggressive in terms of his engages, but, you know, Carzzy had some really big mispositioning mistakes, I would say, down the stretch of this series. I don't know why I said it like that, but everybody else was solid. Like, VTO was great in game number 1. It's really hard to point to him as the problem when he destroyed Nuke in the first game, even if he wasn't nearly as relevant in the back half of this series. Douglas and Photon, I think, were generally fine. Like, Douglas has a hard job here playing tanks into Vi and, you know, really trying to establish that pressure when his lanes are losing, and Photon was probably better than Adam in terms of the grand scheme of this series. There really wasn't anybody on Vitality that I think sprinted it in this series. You maybe just wanted to see a bit more consistency coming out from these players. But I do think that's possible to see going forward. Again, they're not eliminated. They're just moving down into the lower bracket now. Their extra life has been expended, and I think that's fine. You know, Vitality definitely are on the side of the bracket where they could very well still make top 4. And I think top 4 would be, you know, good for them. I think they would be okay with that, an acceptable outcome for what Vitality wanted out of this split. I don't think they expected to be LEC champions. I think theoretically it could have been possible. They came in as the 2 seed, but this is a roundabout where I think their talent level is. And then for BDS, hopefully they can keep this hot run up. This felt like the best team, or the second best team in the league, the best team outside of G2 in winter. And, you know, so far they've felt like that again in the playoffs. And I think if that continues, if they're able to be the number 2 team in the LEC, if they're able to go to MSI, I think they will also consider that a success. So really big win for them to get into the top 3 here. But then moving on to the other of the upper bracket round number 2 series, this will also show us who is qualifying for that winners finals, that top 3 spot alongside BDS. It's the number 1 seeded Fnatic taking on the number 3 seeded G2 Esports. And G2 is going to pick up the win, even with a lower seed, even though they lost to them in the regular season. G2 is going to come out on top when it matters the most, and I'd like to sit here and say that this was some sort of close series, but no, game 1 was 25 minutes, game 2 just over, a hair over 21 minutes. This was not close. G2 controlled this series the entire way through. It was all 5 members. You can criticize some of the players on G2 for maybe not being as consistent as you would like them to be over the course of this year so far, but in this series, nope, not so much. This was really, really good stuff from them. They did everything they were supposed to for Fnatic. Their problems are exposed when they play against teams that are better mechanically than they are. I think that is a pretty nice summary of what Fnatic is as a roster. They don't exactly have the best game plans. They aren't exactly the cleanest team in the entire world, but they are very talented, which means that when they go up against teams that they can just kind of beat, or that they can just kind of win lane against, or win early games against, all of a sudden things become a lot easier. But going up against G2, you're not going to have that same kind of luxury. I know that's not the scouting report that we got when Fnatic beat G2 earlier on in the year, but it's a completely different story when you get into these big series, and I think from a playstyle perspective, this honestly isn't out of the realm of possibility for me to imagine that this was something that was going to happen. So we'll talk about it. Player of the series, pretty obviously, once again, is going to go to Caps. What else do you need me to say to you? Like, this guy's gotten so many player of the series, player of the games over the course of this year. He's got to be around like 9 or 10 across both splits up until this point, and that's ridiculous. I mean, they've only played like how many, 18 regular season games and, a couple of playoff series. Like, really, how many player of the games and series do you even have at your disposal to get? And Caps has gotten so many. He got super fed on the Aurelion Soul, was really able to end the game in one team fight in game number 1, and then he was part of the Azir Brigade that, really went for a lot of these aggressive plays, and he pulled them off. His team fight damage on that champion is ridiculous, but he is amazing. He's just better than everybody else that he's going up against. We'll talk about Humanoid in just a second, but Humanoid's been very good across this year, was the runner-up to my MVP in the winter split. Stood no chance, absolutely no chance in this series. Caps made him look absolutely silly, and that's what he's done against everybody that he's played with. It's not even really an indictment on Humanoid, in my opinion. It's more so, this is just the level that Caps is at the current moment. Big ups to Broken Blade in the top lane, thought he was excellent. Oscar Ridden, again, also not the toughest of competitions in terms of the player that he is playing into. He really struggles when he's not on his comfort picks here. He had to play Aatrox and Olaf. These are not champions that I would necessarily say keep Oscar Ridden as safe as something like the Cassante or the Rek'Sai do. And in fact, Broken Blade pulls out the Rek'Sai. He has been the biggest proponent of top lane Rek'Sai in the LEC, and he continues to dominate on it. He was excellent in this series. That Renekton game in game 1 was awesome. Very nearly player of the series, if only for that Renekton game, which was excellent. The Yike was really good, especially in game 2 when you're talking about how Broken Blade and Caps really took over game 1. I think Yike did a big job of that in game 2. On the Volibear, we've seen other teams not necessarily be able to use his early game priority to actually do a whole ton. Cough, cough, Team Heretics, but going up against Razork, knowing that he has to generate early leads, because Razork is one of those players that can snowball a game out of control quickly, and he is worse from behind, Yike really wants to play aggro, and that's exactly what he did. He was able to get super fed in game number 2, some really great fighting from him to generate that advantage, and Hans and Mickey were also very solid, even on the Jinx Thresh, which I don't even think is that strong of a lane right now, so credit to G2. They're just dominant. They're the best team in Europe, and if they lose in the playoffs here, I'm going to chalk it more up to them kind of not trying than I am going to chalk it up to them not being as good as their opposition. But for Fnatic, you came in here trying. That's one of the nicer things I can say. You kind of got blasted in this series, and as the number 1 seed, that's really not an ideal circumstance to be in, but you got unlucky. Like, having G2 on your side of the bracket is super unlucky, and again, this is, I think, the biggest consequence of this format, and the way this format works is this should not have been the matchup to get to winners finals. G2 should be on the same side as Vitality, and Fnatic should be on the same side as BDS and Heretics, and I think that would have been a significantly more interesting playoff because of the way things work out, because of the way the current format works. G2 ends up being able to push Fnatic down into lower bracket, but I guess we'll talk about this series in and of itself. Dud of the series is going to go to Humanoid. It's not just him. I mean, you want to give this to Oscar Rinnan, who got run over in the top lane matchup. I think that's totally fair. Got to play some champions that he's not comfortable with. If you want to give it to Razork for never really having any pressure in this series against Yike, who was especially ahead in that second game, playing the Jackson to the Volibear, go ahead. If you want to give it to June for really not having any sort of playmaking potential in this series, pulled out the Rumble to pair with the Ashe. This is a bot lane that has worked in other regions like the LPL and the LCK, but June doesn't necessarily have the same kind of skill to be able to pull that off against Hans and Mickey and dominate that 2v2. I mean, Noah was fine generally, but Humanoid's going to get it for me because I just don't think you can get away with picking Corki in game 2. I just do not think that that is something that you're allowed to do. I understand Azir plus Jinx wants to go late. Theoretically, they want to try and scale into that game, and so, playing Corki Jax could be a way to be able to counter that in the late game to actually be able to split and fight in multiple different situations because you have the Zeri and you have the Corki, so you have a lot of options. But the problem is, where is your pressure coming from? You're relying so much on Razork just kind of being better than Yike and actually being able to generate advantages even without being in a good matchup. And lo and behold, it didn't happen because Yike is maybe better than Razork and certainly had a better matchup in this game. And so all of a sudden, this Corki is super far behind. Nobody else on this team is able to do anything in this game is over. When Humanoid loses, he loses hard. His positioning is not particularly safe And so when he loses, he's going to die a lot, and he's going to give a lot of gold over to the enemy. Not a lot of players can just outplay him in this kind of way. Caps is going to be one of the few to actually be able to do that. So just not a good series for Fnatic. Again, they got really roughed up on the draw, I would say, just because of the way this tournament ended up working out, but they moved down to the lower bracket now. They're on the harder side of the bracket as well. They certainly don't get easier challenges from here. So it's going to be interesting to see what ends up happening to them, but congratulations to G2. They've qualified for top 3. They're already at MSI. They just want to win the split so that they can get there and skip the play-in stage. I imagine they're still going to try, but again, like I said earlier, the expectation with this team is to win everything, and if they don't, you're probably just going to chalk it up to them not trying because it doesn't matter if they win it anyways, and so G2's kind of in a really unique spot in that way. But now we get to move back down into round number 1. It does feel a bit strange to go backwards, but it's the lower bracket of round number 1. And if we're just finding out the teams that are moving into the top 3, it's time to find out the first teams that are going to be eliminated from the playoffs in 7th and 8th place, respectively. We've got a matchup between two teams kind of in very different situations that I think there was an expected outcome here. Team Heretics is the 4 seed taking on the 8-seeded SK Gaming. And Heretics is going to pick up the win. It was 2-1, and it was a lot closer than it ever really needed to be, but at least Heretics is going to pick up the win here. I don't think a lot of people expected SK to be able to get out of any of these series with a win. They definitely came in with the least amount of momentum. They got absolutely clobbered in the final week of the season, and historically speaking, this is an organization that starts strong and fizzles out as they continue to go along, not only in terms of, you know, their year as a whole. It's kind of funny. That kind of applies to them as a whole. SK as an organization was really strong when they first formed and were really good in 2013 and 2014, and then, you know, slowly this org has just become less relevant, and then when you apply it to a year, well, they're known for doing well early on. Ever since winter has been introduced, they've done really well in winter and then slowly gotten worse in spring and slowly gotten worse in summer, so they trail off that way. Then when you look at their week-to-week kind of performance, they've been really good historically in week number 1, and then weeks 2 and 3, not so much. They trail off that way, and then you look at the series that they had in this playoffs. They won game 1 in both of their series and then lost games 2 and 3, with game 2 being relatively competitive and game 3 being a blowout in both cases. It's really crazy how consistent this narrative is for SK, that they start strong and end weak in almost every aspect of this franchise. It is quite literally insane to kind of think about it in that way, but congratulations to Heretics for being able to move on. They played well, and specifically Zviru in the mid lane played really well. He's going to get player of the series for me. He was excellent in this matchup. Certainly the better mid laner down the stretch of this series, made the least amount of mistakes of anybody on Heretics, but was very proactive. Again, typically I'm pretty anti like LEC Azir syndrome, because it just becomes a bit of a problem when your main carry in a lot of cases is going into the front line trying to make this big play, specifically when you have other playmakers, other engagers on the roster. You don't really need to rely on Azir engage, Azir, Shreem, and Shuffle, right? A lot of times you don't need to rely on that, and yet these players still go for those plays because they want the big moment. Oftentimes I think you're better off trying to deal damage on the backline and saving that ult for something that's a little bit more pressing, either if you get dove on the backline or potentially to secure a kill later on in the fight. And Zviru, I think, you know, was a little bit more aggressive with some of those engages, but they were very flashy, and oftentimes they were the right thing to do. You don't actually have consistent playmakers on this team in the same kind of way, at least in game 3. You didn't really have a consistent playmaker. You have Sejuani and potentially Cassante to set those things up, but you've got a Jinx, you've got Amelia. You don't really have somebody that can just kind of press the go button, and Azir kind of does that in a different way. So this is the kind of circumstance in which I like to see more aggression coming out of the Azir, and I think Zviru played it really well. It's funny that he wasn't even really supposed to play this split, and this team has gotten better with him in the mid lane. I think the rest of this team was good as well. Flakkid had a very good series. He has benefited a lot from Trimby coming into this team. Their 2v2 is significantly stronger this split than it was last split. I think Kaiser's a very good player, and one that it's a real shame that he doesn't have an LEC spot. I don't think that's going to last the entirety of the year, but Flakkid, I think, in particular, has benefited from having Trimby, who's just better in the isolated 2v2, and Trimby's obviously a very good voice. He likes to play these enchanters, he likes to focus a bit more on the early game, and I think that does help for Heretics, and it helps Flakkid kind of get to that part of the game where he's more comfortable, which is those team fights. Wunder was very good. Some people would say that he wasn't the better top laner in the series. I don't really know how you would make that assertion, that assessment. Irrelevant was fine. He was just kind of there. We'll talk about him when we get there. I know him a bit lower on Irrelevant, pretty notoriously, but Wunder was better, I would say, in this series, and yeah, Jankos was certainly more active than Isma, even if I don't think every single play that he went for was perfect. But Zviru was really the carry in this series. I don't really think there's any other way to look at it. And then for SK, not a good series, especially down the stretch for them. Just a really bad game 3. And I think that's going to leave a sour taste in a lot of people's mouths. Done of the series was really difficult because both Niski and Exakick were both horrendous down the stretch. Niski just kind of quirky packaging to his doom and immediately dying in a fight is very funny. And Exakick playing Lucian and not being particularly good and not really following what that champion wants to do. You know, we always talk about how Lucian Nami is significantly better than kind of the reputation that surrounds those two champions, but that's in the context of Lucian's an assassin. Like, when you play him like an assassin, when you're dashing in and out of fights, and when you're trying to attack priority targets, you know, going off of your cooldowns, then he actually is a pretty strong champion. But when you try to play him like a traditional AD carry and your positioning is horrible and none of that ends up working, then all of a sudden, oops, you're really not relevant in any of these fights. And so Exakick was not good, completely ran it down in game 3. Niski was not good, completely ran it down in game 3. I'm giving dud of the series to Niski because I do think he lost a little bit more overall down the stretch, and I think the middle of the map is more important, but Exakick was also very, very poor. I think Doss was, funnily enough, pretty good this series, was actually able to get his Rakan, which I think has been his biggest pick across his LEC career so far, but again, the Lucian Nami didn't really work in the final game. And then again, Isma was fine, Irrelevant was fine. They really weren't problems. They weren't exactly solutions to any of the answers. I think a lot of people are going to sit here and say, oh, Irrelevant's elo held. You know, I think that's true to an extent. Like, could he be an upgrade for a team like Fnatic? I think that is likely the case, but I don't think he's like a game breaker in the same way that Photon is a game breaker, as we saw in the series where they went head to head. And so I think this is relatively fine. SK losing out, being the first team eliminated from the playoffs, it's not particularly surprising. I think the shocking part was just how they went about it, winning a couple of games. They did look at least a little bit competent, but their issues came back to bite them, I would say, in the end. And then for Heretics, they move on now to take on Fnatic. Certainly not the easiest series in the entire world for them to try and make top 4. That's why I called this the harder side of the bracket, is because one of these teams is going to be eliminated, and I think both of them are top 4 teams in the region. Even if Heretics does look a little bit clumsier at the current moment, there's a lot to like about this team, and I think they restored some of my faith and confidence with this series. I just don't know if it's going to be enough to get past the #1 seed in the league. But that's going to bring us to our final series of the video and our second of the lower bracket round 1 series. The second team to be eliminated will be shown here, and the winner, of course, takes on Vitality. It's GIANTX, the #6 seed, taking on the #7 seeded Mad Lions Koi. And Mad Lions is going to get the job done. It did take 3 games, which you wouldn't necessarily maybe expect going into this series, but remember, GIANTX was playing better than anybody thought they would down the stretch here. I think Mad Lions definitely struggled a bit more in this series than maybe you would have anticipated, but they got the job done nonetheless. There are a couple of things that you can point to as major positives. I think specifically the carry roles for Mad Lions that we are going to go over, where I don't think if you had those 2 players, you probably don't win this series, or at least you don't win it nearly as easily as you did in games 2 and 3, which were very much in your favor. But for GX, they actually had a real shot here. A couple of really good plays. You were able to get a lot of gold into a lot of really important areas. You just weren't able to capitalize on it. Unfortunately, the mistakes made by some of the veterans on this team were really just too much to overcome for GX, and that's kind of been, you know, a recurring theme, I will say, for them across this year. It's actually the veterans, it's actually the players that have been in this organization for a while that are kind of letting them down at the current moment, but we'll talk about that. Mad Lions, we'll start with them, of course. Player of the series is going to go to Frescowy in the mid lane. I don't love Ahri in either of these games. I think playing Ahri into Azir means that you really are required to be super active on the map, that you want to try and skirmish as much as possible, but you're kind of pairing that with a, you know, a Sejuani or a Rel or a Sivir and Zeri combo in the bot lane. Like, you don't really have a ton of other skirmish tools on this team to try and make that mid-game assassin playstyle worth it. That being said, Frescowy was awesome in this series. Dude was ridiculous on Ahri. He was able to create so many advantages. I talk about like the point-and-click charms all the time when you're just so on point, when you're able to hit those clutch charms every single time you need to. All of a sudden, the game becomes a lot easier because that is such a strong ability, not only for you, but for the rest of your team as well. And Frescowy was amazing. The playoff buff that he gets is truly, you know, generational. We can talk about people like Mirwin also having a similar buff, but Frescowy really is the kind of player that is just kind of fine. Like, he's good in the regular season, and he's great once he gets to these best of 3s, best of 5s, especially as these longer days end up going on. That is a very valuable trait for a team like MDK to have, and I think that, you know, he's kind of proven it at this point. And then for Supa, I think he was the other player that I really want to shout out is like, wow, what a great game. What a great series from Supa. Went behind a bit in Game 3 on the Sivir. I cannot believe he picked Sivir in Game 3 with his season on the line, with his split on the line. You're pulling out Sivir of all the champions. That is a crazy pull, and he goes down in the early game. Zeri gets really far ahead because of some really well-timed resource management coming in from GX. The problem is Patrick really played the late game very poorly, and Supa did a great job of getting himself back into this series. He's great on Zeri, and the Sivir ended up actually working out because he got to the point where he was at 3 items and could actually fight. And I think for MDK, you really gotta, rely on Supa. Whether or not you are a fan that wants to see him succeed or fail, he is very integral to how MDK want to play the game. And I think when he is playing well, then this team wins, and when he's not, then they often aren't in great positions. And so it's good to see him play well here for that win. Mirwin was definitely the better top laner of the two. We'll talk about it. I think it was more Odoamne playing poor than it was Mirwin playing great, but still, coming off of a couple of series in the regular season where he just wasn't very good for MDK, I think it's really nice to see that. Elyoya, I think, bounced back a little bit nicer than maybe he did in some of the previous series, and Alvaro was certainly a positive. MDK was just good. I don't think they were great in this series, and they certainly don't look like a team that should be in top 4 right now. They look like the 7th seed. They look like the team that we thought they were in the regular season, but that's still enough to get over GX. And then for GX, again, it's the veterans. It's the people who have been in this org, on this team for a while. Odoamne is going to get done of the series yet again for this team. He was awful over the course of this weekend. In both of the best of 3s that they played in, he truly was like a game-losing level player. This was EU, this was Western Jace at its absolute finest, where he is just constantly getting caught out, not really putting out any sort of damage, and really just not being useful in any sort of way on the Jason. It's just disappointing to see because we know what Odoamne can do at his best. It's just not even been remotely close to that in the recent months. And then Patrick. Patrick was 5-0 on this Zeri in game number 3, and somehow, some way, he ends the game doing so little damage in some of these fights. Team fighting has always been a bit inconsistent for him, but his positioning has always been a strength, and it just isn't anymore. I'm really starting to lose faith in Patrick. Ignar, I think, was really good this series in terms of setting up his bot laner to get a lot of things, and typically, Ignar is the type of player that plays around the skill level, and so you would expect things to be going well for GX, but Ignar was doing really well. Patrick was not following up. Jackie's, I think, played really well in the playoffs here. Maybe not like at a superstar level, but certainly kept his own against Frescowy, who was playing well on the other side of this matchup, but then he would also get caught out for a couple of pretty major mistakes, and his laning still is a bit of a problem. Peach, I think, was, again, fine, but was way too far forward, and when you're playing these engagers, you're going to get caught out in bad situations if you try to contest objectives that you don't have prio for. So generally, yes, like the problems for GX are apparent, but it's Odoamne and Patrick that I'm really concerned about, and those are not the two that I expected to be concerned about. Maybe Patrick you could have sold me on being a bit more of a problem going into the year, but Odoamne being as bad as he has been in 2024, it's just shocking to me, and it's not really something I anticipated. But GX's spring split is over. They're going to have to play for summer now. I don't really know if they are going to make any changes. I would certainly consider some, but I don't really know what direction you might want to go in, so it'll be interesting to see what they do. But for MDK, you move on now to take on Vitality. That is a winnable series. Vitality is certainly not an untouchable team, and so I think MDK is very happy and very lucky that they ended up on this side of the bracket, and at least for now, their dreams of going back-to-back in top 4 are still alive. All right, but that is going to do it for my LEC Round 1 and kind of Round 2 overview and analysis video. Of course, up on the screen, the updated playoff bracket. After our first weekend of games here, we know our 2 teams in the top 3 in winners finals, G2 and BDS, making their way there again for the second split in a row. And we know our 4 teams that have stayed alive in the lower part of the bracket. Fnatic taking on Team Heretics, Vitality taking on Mad Lions Koi. Certainly going to be 2 fun matchups. If you want my quick predictions, I'm not going to go super in-depth on them here, but I would expect Fnatic to be able to get past Heretics. I think they are a more complete team, and I would expect Humanoid and Razork to actually have a very good series. Potentially Noah and June could do some interesting things as well because they have gotten better. And then for Vitality versus Mad Lions, I would say typically Vitality should be favorites here because they've been better across this split. However, if you know anything about the LEC, you know that Vitality never lives up to expectations, and you also know that, Mad Lions got destroyed by G2. They've been underperforming in the regular season. They barely got past GX in a series that should have been significantly more, I guess, obvious to win for them. It should have been easier for them than it absolutely was. that absolutely means they're going to win and they're going to make it into top 4. I don't know why this is a conversation. Of course, this is how things are going to go. So I'm picking Mad Lions. I don't think Mad Lions is the better team, but I do think because of the way that the LEC works and the voodoo that is around here, that's what's probably going to happen. So those are my picks, Fnatic and Mad Lions. Moving on to the final 4, but I would love to know your thoughts and opinions down below. Do you agree with me? Do you disagree with me? What did you think of the games? Who here is surprising you and who here is not surprising you? Are there any teams that got eliminated in SK and GX that maybe you didn't think were going to go out? I think a lot of people could have predicted those were the 2 worst teams in the bracket, but still worth noting that they were the 2 teams that went out first. So we'd just love to hear your thoughts on everything going on in the LEC down below. Of course, if you enjoyed the video, leave a like. It really does mean a lot to me. Lets me know you guys are enjoying the content, and it does help get this video out to a lot more people, which I'm always very appreciative of. If you're new here, hit subscribe. We don't only post about the LEC. LCK and LPL playoffs are going on right now, and they're rocking and rolling. We're posting about them basically every day on this channel, and then, of course, MSI is just around the corner. Once LEC playoffs wrap up, same thing with the Eastern playoffs, then we've got this big mid-season invitational that I'm going to be covering every single day on this channel, so hit subscribe and hit that bell if you want a comprehensive overview of everything going on in LoL Esports. But with all that being said, I hope you all are having a great day. Hope you continue to have a great day, and I will see you all